was epic. Did the blah castle? And I make them like they used to. I once had visitors we were hosting from England, and we're like, we're going to take you to like our own castle. They've never been to Australia before, and we took them to Blah Castle. I'm like, you guys made this, and like, that doesn't make sense. And like, yeah, you have castles in England, and you guys, you came to Australia and brought castles with you, and they're like, I guess that makes sense. So they think it's an original OG castle from the feudal era. Super cool to have you here. Thanks for joining us on Father's Day. And if you're new to church, maybe you got dragged along here by your kid, or you're a kid that got dragged along by your dad and said, you will do this for Father's Day and come to church. It's so cool that you're with us. I had kind of my Father's Day celebration yesterday with my two little girls. They got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And, we had a kind of beautiful moments together. And there's a famous film where there's a line at Father's Day where every time he gets a gift, he's like, this is going straight to the... Now, I don't have a pool room. I'm not that cool, but I do have like a study with a couple of books in it. So I'm like, this has gone straight to my study. But my favorite line from this particular film called The Castle is this, and you're probably familiar with it. It's a man's home is his castle. You guys, maybe you haven't seen the film. There's like a famous line. It's this idea that your area of responsibility, your life, what you have, and wherever you kind of, and by home, don't necessarily mean you have to be the dad or a husband or anything like that. It's just the environment in which you call home. It's like your castle, the area you've been given responsibility over. Now, historically, castles served two roles. Their roles were this: number one, to protect, and secondly, to help flourish. So in other words, castles were built to, if there was a community built around some sense of agriculture, they wanted to be able to protect the people and the villages. And so they put up this stronghold, so if there was ever attacked from the outside, people could be protected inside. But the flip side of that, it also wanted to help people who lived in and around the castle to flourish. So if you kind of had livestock or you did some sort of farming, you want there to be encouraged that, it'd be a safe environment for you to grow a family. And so castles represented these two ideas: to protect and to flourish. And this is what I guess kind of what we want to look at across this series, because in many ways, isn't this true of what we want for our lives? We want to look at how we go about the lives we live and the responsibilities we have, recognizing there's often external threats. And whether you're new to church or you've been a Christian for a long time, perhaps I certainly know this is true of me. I look at a lot of the world, and a lot of what I see out there, I'm like, I don't want to get in here. I don't want it to get in my heart, in my life, in my home, around my family. And so we want to spend the next 4 weeks talking about this idea of turning your life into a castle. And we want to answer this question: is how do we avoid the messes out there becoming messes in here? And have you ever felt overwhelmed when you look at the state of much of the world, and maybe there's something you may be married to someone, or you live with someone who are always talking about things that anger them about the world and this next generation, how the world is, and they may be true. But just because things are a certain way in the environments around us, is there anything within Christianity, is there anything the Jesus way shows us to help avoid messes out there becoming messes in here? And, I've got my two children, the absolute light of my life. And one of my favorite things is just me and Chloe would just often sit and watch them play in our tiny little backyard. And you can guarantee, whenever there's a tiny bit of dirt patch in my ever failing back lawn, they will intentionally go with hoses and blast that spot of dirt to turn it into a mud area. They absolutely think it's fantastic. And so it's fun. And they're often smearing the mud everywhere, which we don't mind. Till the other day I got home and noticed that the mud they smeared in our newly white rendered back retaining wall was not mud at all. They got their hands on paint. And so my daughter's an graffiti artist, and it's wonderful. We'll just leave it there for a few years until we get around to having spare time to paint that. But I don't mind there being mess out there, right? And everyone who's responsible for a household knows that mess out there is fine. The problem is when the mess gets inside. So keep all the dirt out there you want, daughters, but just don't bring the dirt inside my house. And so we'll put up protective barriers around that, hopefully, like a mat and some water, and you dry yourself and clean yourself and all that before you come inside. And so I think this is what we want to recognize in our own lives at a much broader end. It's there can be a whole lot of maybe dynamics or values or behaviors or worldviews or convictions, or maybe even traits that you see in the environments of community around us. And again, this doesn't even have to be a faith thing to you. If you're someone exploring faith, maybe there's just something about the world you're like, it just doesn't sit with the kind of thing I want to see in my home. This is a series for you. And this is a tension we all feel one way or another. Now, Now, there's three areas I want to look at particularly today, but over the course of this series, we're going to cover about how to make our lives like a castle, to help the things that we don't want to impact our inner world, keep it at bay, but also to help our inner life to flourish. And the three areas of this, our first area is our homes. Our homes. And by homes, I mean the area literally where you put your head on your pillow, your head on your pillow at night. This is so important because this is the place you come home to from work. This is a place where most people have their prayer life. Most of the people do family and friendship life around your home. And so here's the deal. You need to be taking intentional responsibility about the environment that you and I get the chance to create around our home. So we're going to look at that. The second area is our head, our thoughts, our mind. You're responsible for it. And there's so much in the Christian faith. And we're going to look at this over this series. Next week, you are not going to want to miss. We have an amazing friend of ours coming to speak here, Jason Perkins. We've had him here speak before, but he speaks a whole lot to the area of what's going on in the inside part of our lives. You're not going to want to miss it. It's super helpful stuff. And finally, ultimately, our hearts. And again, this is where a big part of the Christian message gets right to the heart of. And so these three areas we want to, I guess, kind of look at what are a lot of the practical things you and I can do to protect this. Now, this became apparent to me just over about 3.5 years ago now, if we think of it. Do you all remember when we all started talking about COVID for the first time? You saw it in the news. We started seeing in the papers. I remember getting heads up from people who worked in the hospital going, hey, I think there's this thing called lockdowns are going to happen. And so I rushed out to Coles just before it closed at 9 p.m. and I packed my trolley full of toilet paper and long life milk. And I was prepared, for the end times. And do you remember that stage? Where were you? Where were you living? A lot of you probably weren't even on the coast then. And welcome. I still recall being mindful that, our health services, our government, our authorities were running ragged, trying to make sure things were kept safe out there. Because this was new, it was novel. So as they were figuring that out, and we're glued to the television every day waiting for ScoMo, remember those updates he'd give us with his chart? We're all, that's all happening out there. But it dawned on me very quickly. As much as there's people we vote for and people we employ, to take care of matters out there, I cannot delegate the responsibilities that are mine to someone else. And there are parts of my life, irrespective of what's going on out there, that I have to be responsible for in here. And whilst the government at that time was responsible for stewarding order out there, you and I are always responsible for stewarding the order that goes on in here, in our life. You cannot outsource the inward. When it comes to your life, your beautifully loved, valued life, the life that was created by your Heavenly Father, the life that God values so much that He sent His own begotten Son, Jesus, to die for, to let you know how much your life is worth. The care of that part of your world, you can't outsource it to a government, to a doctor. You can't outsource that to others. This is yours and my responsibility. So it begs the question, I want to look at this question over this series. If you want to set up your life and your world like a castle to help protect from things that are toxic or dangerous from getting inside, and also to help the parts that you are responsible for to flourish, how do we go about this? What can we intentionally do? And whose version of life have I let creep in at times? And maybe when it comes to areas like success, and when it comes to areas like our lifestyles or our pace of life, or how we define values and virtues, who's defining that for you? And are you accepting a version of your life that has been given to you by something outward, or are you taking on a vision of your life and a vision of your future from your Heavenly Father? In fact, this challenge is so old. This is way before our time. In fact, this is a challenge that went even before Jesus arrived on the scene. One of the ancient kings of Israel, King Solomon, wrote down an amazing picture of this tension, and we got it recorded in the book of Proverbs in our Old Testament. He writes this. It says, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Now think of this. You and I can't control everything, and I'm going to use this term out there and define that however you want. You and I can't control the world. We can't control all the dynamics of the environment around us. But you and I are in control, namely, of ourselves. That's what we've been encouraged to take control of, our own lives. And the picture Solomon uses here is that if you're in control of your life, if you're in control of your environment, your head, your heart, and you take that responsibility seriously, you're like a castle. You're like a fortress that is impenetrable. But the moment you stop taking control of the areas of your life that is your responsibility, the image he uses is like a city whose walls are broken through, like a castle that is broken down. So my question to you is this: are you taking responsibility for all the areas of your life? Now, this is a big challenge to Jesus' followers, particularly because right at the heart of the Christian message from the very beginning, Christians weren't just invited to believe something. And indeed, we are invited to believe something, but that wasn't where it ended. We were invited to do something, to live life a certain way. We were invited to follow the Jesus way of life. And so if you're a Jesus follower here, this series is going to be hopefully challenging and annoying all at the same time, with a little bit of encouragement splattered through so you feel okay about your life. That was a bit of a joke, but no one laughed. I'll soften that for tonight. But the idea is we have a path to follow, a way to follow, and at times it can seem inconvenient to the broader context of how to live life and the environments we live in. And so the New Testament has so much instruction about how we live out the Jesus life, and we're going to look at that, a few of the things that were taught through this series. I want to begin today with one particular passage written by the Apostle Paul, and if you're new to church, you never opened a Bible before, Paul is a common figure we come to when we read from the Bible, particularly because 2/3 of our New Testament were letters written by him to Christians who lived in a world that was largely not Christian. So Christians were outliers, Christians were the minority, more and more like we are in Australia today. And so he writes about how to conduct your life now that you're a believer in Jesus, how you're supposed to live. And he writes to Christians, particularly in this letter written to those living in the city of Ephesus, which is in ancient Turkey. And it was a very secular city, lots of different religions there. It's a very wealthy city. It was a Roman colony. So there's a lot going on there. And Christians were learning to flourish in a world that wasn't a Christian society. And here's what he writes them. He says, I tell you this and insist on in the Lord. Notice these words here. He says that you must no longer live. So it wasn't talking about the difference of belief. It's talking about the difference of living. You're no longer to live as the Gentiles do. And the Gentiles is the term, and this probably a better translation here is the word you get pagan, or essentially non-believers, non-Christians. No longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking, meaning their whole world is wrapped up in what they can get their heads around. He goes, don't limit your life to just what you can get your head around. The Christian worldview invites you to something much bigger than that. It invites you to a life that is bigger than that. And he goes on and explains the ways that a life that's just lived in his terms, the futility of thinking, is outworked. And he concludes by saying this: all that way of living is not the way of life that you learned when you heard about Christ. Now, let me just reiterate this again. I'm talking about something that you and I are responsible for. If you are a believer in Jesus, you are invited by grace through faith to trust your lives into the hands of your heavenly Father. So there's nothing you and I can do that's going to make us better with God or more right with God or more loved by God. That is through faith in Jesus Christ alone. But now that you've got that settled, how am I supposed to live? Like, what does a life that trusts Jesus look like? Is it different to other lives? Is there anything distinctive by it? As we'll see, the challenge is, well, yes, there is. It says there is a way of life that you learned when you heard about Christ and you were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. Now, before you rush ahead and think Jono's just going to go on and bash pop culture now and he loves to do this and he loves to point at things that are wrong with history and culture and society, before you get there, again, I want to affirm the Christian teaching around this. The greatest evil the gospel shows us isn't something that is out there. The Bible teaches us that the greatest evil is in here. That our greatest enemies aren't things that are coming against us from all corners of the earth. The greatest evil you and I will ever confront is the things that dwell up from the inside. Scripture refers to this time and time again as sin. Something that would separate you and I from the life of our Heavenly Father. And again, you might not be a Christian and you might not call things sin, but you certainly know there's been things in your life that after you've done them, you go, that didn't lead to life. That didn't make things better. That actually made things worse. Christians refer to that as sin. And they can be everything from anger to lust to hatred to jealousies, greed, impatience, envy. They dwell in us. And so at times, the greatest protection we need isn't from things out there, they're from things that can dwell up in here. And this is the most wonderful thing about the Christian message is that through faith in Jesus Christ, you are offered not just protection from sin, you're offered forgiveness of sin and freedom from sin, that those things no longer have to define your life and define your future and have rulership and ownership over your life. It's a pretty amazing truth. And Paul goes on to affirm this part of our life that has attention. He says this, the next verse. He goes, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. Now think of this. How often you talk about maybe some of the biggest threats against your future or your family flourishing or your hopes and dreams, we refer to things that are happening out there. The economy or government or my boss or the housing market. And it's true, those can be tensions and dynamics we all wrestle with. Paul puts his finger on this point here about our own deceitful desires. Things in our own life that can sabotage our potential or sabotage our future. And we cannot miss this, because I don't want us to talk about certain challenges I'm about to get into, things you and I can do about our way of life with missing the major point. That the hope of all this stems from the fact that when we come to Christ, he deals with not our enemies out there, he deals with our enemies in here. The things in our life that rob us short of our own potential. The things in our life that you might walk away feeling like, I don't measure up as a dad, I'm too impatient, or I don't measure up as a wife, I find myself being too angry with this, or however you feel yourself, you don't measure up in whatever seasons of life you're in. Paul gets right to the heart of it and said, the enemy might not be something out there, it could be something in here. And when we come to Christ, he deals with those part of us that is our responsibility to lay down before him. And he offers us, as much as he offers forgiveness to the whole world, he offers forgiveness for you and I too. In fact, this is such a big point. There's a remarkable book. If you ever have 2.5 spare years of your life to read a single book in one sitting, you can read an amazing book called, amazing is one term for it, and I always pronounce it incorrectly, but The Gulag Archipelago. And it was written by a Russian author who was sent to prison in the gulags in Russia after the Bolsheviks took over Russia in the early 20th century. And it's an amazing book. And again, it's a critique about government and politics and different worldviews. But right to the core of the book, he gets to the issue of humanity. And he says this is a famous part of his book. He says, gradually it was disclosed that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, which was the big tension of Russia during his day, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. So we often point out evil that is out there. He's saying, don't get construed. Evil can hit any heart. It can hit any person's life. And this is the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that it is for everyone. And it offers everyone's forgiveness. It offers everyone a second chance. And it offers everyone grace in order to go about living lives that would please God and would lead to a flourishing, fruitful future. So in light of that, this is where Paul gets very practical. He kind of lists all this out, and then this is kind of the verse I want to sit on this morning. He then says in the next chapter about listing what it looks like to kind of follow your deceitful desires and to follow the ways of the world and live a life that isn't pleasing to God. And then he says this, I want you, this is to Jesus followers, I want you to be very careful then how you live. Let me ask you, are you careful how you live? Think about your life, your home environment, your head, your heart. Would you use the term careful? And Paul's like, hey, in light of all the wonderful things that have been done with us, for us through Jesus, are you careful with how you live? Do you actually think about it? Now, I know we think about our belief and we think about our jobs and we think about our family, but do you think about your life? Do you ever pause and consider, how am I living? Then he goes on the next sentence and clarifies it a bit further. He says, don't live as unwise, but as wise. Now, I thought he might have written, don't live as unbelieving, but believing, but he's already writing to believing people. So he's saying, now that you believe, I want you to be wise with how you live your life. And I love the fact that he uses the term wise, because this is so much better than I want you to be good people. Because we can often, can't we talk in terms of what's good and bad, what's right and wrong. Maybe for you it's what's legal and illegal, and just help me find the line and I'll dance on that line. Hey, it's not illegal, you know. But he doesn't use that. He says, don't live as unwise, live as wise. In considering the environments around you and the world we live in and the pressures that we're all under, are you wise with your life? And he concludes by saying this, making the most of every opportunity. In other words, leveraging the time you've got, being intentional about your life, not wasting any moment because the days are what? Now, this should be encouraging to us all because these are Christians in the first century. This is the conviction they live with. They looked around the world they're in and they concluded, yes, the times we live in are pretty evil. There's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of barbarism. The human life's cheap. There's oppressive governments. There's a lot of evil out there. But Christians' invitation weren't to hide away in caves and disappear and be fearful and shake their fists at the world. He says you need to look at your life. That's one area you're in control of. And be wise with how you live. In fact, we won't touch on this today, but one of the big parts of the Christian life is how we live can often be our biggest witness to the hope that we have in Jesus. Not just what we say and what we preach, but our very lives. So I want to talk about those three areas today in the remaining 15 seconds I have left about how to live wise with those three areas that you have responsibility for. So number one, your home. The world might be in darkness, but your home doesn't have to. It's your castle. It's your environment. When my eldest daughter started school, we're pretty intentional about the environment we create in our home. We've got to live there, so we might as well enjoy it and be intentional with it. And we noticed as she started spending more time at school, she would bring home with her certain attitudes or certain words or certain ideas and behaviors that she didn't get from us. At least we didn't think she got it from us. So she started doing it, and I'm no pro at a parent, but this is just how I'm trying to put this into practice in my life. I would crouch down on her level when she'd talk to a sister or myself or her mom in a certain tone or say certain things, and I go, Willa, I know you might have heard things at school today, and I know you might see your friends talking in certain ways to one another, and I get that. Can't control them, can't control the world, but in this house, we don't talk to one another like that. In this house, we are kind. In this house, we use our manners. In this house, we don't chuck tantrums to get our way. You see what I'm doing? So it's letting her know. If I don't let her know, then she won't know. So what am I doing? The first thing you got to recognize when it comes to making your home a castle is you must encourage intentionally what you're chasing. You got to talk about it. You got to celebrate it. You got to affirm it. You can't outsource it to teachers or doctors, as much as we love those people, or even your pastors. If you're responsible for an environment with other people living with you, whether you're parent, sibling, friend, housemates, whatever it is, you have to be intentional about encouraging the environment that you want. Set expectations. Cast a vision for it. Teach it regularly. Call it out when you see it. Secondly, and this is super important, you must model it. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to live it out. So let me ask you, and this is just particularly for a moment, for parents here. Do you model the type of environment that you think would be healthy and conducive to human flourishing with your words? Do you model it with your presence when you walk in the home? Are you still on your phone all the time, or are you present? Are you active? Are you there? Are you listening? Are you a non-anxious presence? Are you regularly incorporating prayer into your home? So it's not a weird thing, it's a natural thing. Are you intentional about protecting what values and what influences come in your home or not? Do you know what your children are watching on their phones and what music they're listening to? I'm not trying to guilt anyone, I'm just asking you, do you care about this? If you care that your home is a castle, you must encourage it and then you must model it. You must model it through the music you let in your home, what social media you let people engage in, what films you watch, what friendships there are, what influences allow in. This is old school stuff, right? This is the stuff that when I was a 13-year-old sitting in the back row hearing my dad preach about this stuff, I'd be like, boring. We didn't have like my own, I had like a Game Boy, to play on or something. Didn't have phones. Remember those? They were the days. Simpler times. And thirdly, you got to commit to it. You've got to be consistent. So again, doing this stuff, it's not about doing big, extraordinary things every so often. It's about the little things that you and I do daily. Daily, little things. You don't have to be the most extraordinary person. Okay, family meeting. It's like, oh, the family meeting. Once a blue man, we're only doing this because we finally pushed dad to the limit. It's no, be consistent every day. Too real. All right. I got to keep cruising. Secondly, so that's your home. Secondly, your head. Your head. This space between your ears. When COVID first hit, I quickly realized that there was a virus going around that, yes, it would affect my body, but there was another kind of virus that was going around that could get to my mind. fear, worry, anger. You've got to recognize the ideas, attitudes, beliefs, images, pattern, rhythms, addictions. We either foster them or we purge them from our heads. You either foster them or you purge them. You either allow them or you refuse them. You either encourage it or you push them away. Your mind, you have to think of it like a castle. Are you intentional with what you let in your head? This is why we're humans. This is why what we watch, what we listen to, what we read is a big deal. So first thing I want to talk about, how do you turn your head into a castle? That's such a weird statement that probably no one's ever said. What we watch. And we'll touch into deeper over the course of this series, but like, you barely have to walk a meter out of your home these days. How much sexual imagery is now everywhere in our community. It's not for the perverts. It's not for those who have deep, dark secrets. It's just everywhere. And our children are impacted by it. Our marriages are impacted by it. Our minds are impacted by it. So I don't say this to condemn or to shame or embarrass anyone. I'm saying this because I love you and I believe in you, and it matters to me that you don't let your head get to a place that ruins all your relationships. It puts this dark lens on how you see the whole world. And I'm not going to give you 5 steps today of what to do with that. That'll be probably in the last message of this series. So be ready for that. But I do want to encourage you, are you being intentional about what you literally watch and what you let expose your imagination and your thoughts? It's a big deal. It's a huge deal. I'll let Dr. Chris Moller deal with that in 3 weeks' time on the panel. Thank you, Chris, wherever you're sitting. Secondly, who we spend time with. Who we spend time with. Again, this is as old as language. We're people. And so are you intentional with those you let be in your world, those you let be close to you, your environments, the people you let speak into your life? We don't talk about this too often because it's almost like, what are you telling me? I can't have certain people in my friendship groups. Well, listen, all I know is this. There's been times in my life where I've been very, very vulnerable in my headspace. And I had to be very intentional about who I spoke to and who I ignored. Because there's some people I could speak to that would make me worse off, or that would just feed my fears or feed my insecurities. And the other people who would remind me of who I am and remind me that I'm loved by God and remind me of what God's promises are for me. So you need to be intentional about who you lean to when your head is in a vulnerable state, who you spend time with. And I also want to encourage you, particularly if you're a Christian here, are you the kind of person that is good for someone when they're going through struggle? Are you an encouraging person? Are you a person that reminds people of God's heart towards them? What kind of person are you? What kind of person are you around the place where you spend every day working or going to school? When people say, go see that person, what are they referring to? Is it, oh, you're low? Go talk to them. Or you're lost? Go and talk to them. Or is it, oh, you're a bad dude? Yeah, go hang with them. You'll love. I don't know. Like, what kind of person are you? And finally, what we meditate on. I often think about this when it comes to ideas or, news articles or conspiracy theories, or this is the latest thing to be careful of. When I give my mind to, particularly at night when all my jobs for the day are done and you got that rare moment just to yourself, everything's done. I ask these 2 questions. Is it hopeful and is it helpful? If I think about this, is it going to lead me to being hopeful for my future and the future? And is it helpful? Can I do anything with this information? If not, I don't meditate on it. My head is such a precious space in my life, and yours is too. Make it a castle. And finally, our hearts. Our hearts. Our hearts is a place where you and I process the events that happen to us, for us, and by us. It's where we deal with things like grief, guilt, offense, shame, unforgiveness, hardness, hurt, disappointment. And in fact, we skipped over a few of the verses between what Paul wrote earlier, but there's one verse I want to jump right in the middle of where he talks about the idea of our heart. Back in the chapter 4, he says, these are Gentiles, people who weren't following Jesus. He said, they are darkened in their understanding, separated from the life of God. How's that for a statement? Separated from the life of God. What a horrible place to be in. And no one has to be separated from the life of God, ever. Maybe you feel like you are. Maybe you feel like there's some weird separation between you and God. Maybe Paul is giving you here a little hint on something that can be a breakthrough for your life. He says they're separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. So this isn't just some modern psychological idea, our hearts. This is ancient, recognizing that the part of human desire, of human emotion, of the human experience that we've always referred to as the heart. And one of the dangers of our hearts is that it can become hardened. You and I go through enough hard things in life that if we don't manage it well enough, hard things will lead to a hard heart. A hardened heart will always follow when we allow the world around us to become the world within us. Got that slide? Thanks, bro. And think about your own heart right now. I know it's how do you define it's been a hard heart, but I just want to ask you this. Have you let too much of the tone, the talk, the conviction, the ethos, the values of the broader environments that is nothing like what Jesus showed us? Have you let it get inside your life too much? And often a sign of that is you become a bit you might look sideways whenever it comes to the Christian way of life. You might like roll your eyes at the Christian way of life. You might always have an excuse why that doesn't count for you. They're often signs that something's hard in your heart. So here's the 3 things about a heart I wanted to be considerate of. How to avoid getting a hard heart and putting a castle, a stronghold, a fortress around our hearts. Is number 1, be intentional about your pace of life. Who is setting your pace of life? We often talk about the principle of Sabbath in this church because we believe when you pause from all your work and what you're doing is you're pausing from feeling like you have to be the savior of your whole life and you make room for God to be God in your life. And when you stop working, he's just beginning his work. So are you intentional about your pace? Are you run ragged? Have you filled your diary right to the edge of its margins, that there's no margin in your life to breathe and to celebrate and have fun and enjoy the fruits of your labor? The Christian life invites you and I to a different pace of life. This is what Paul referred to as the way of life. He's like, your life shouldn't be just chasing after the dollar no matter what. That's how Gentiles do it. What about your pace of life? Are you living for something greater and more fulfilling? Secondly, your priorities. Your priorities. How quickly when we get the wrong priorities does this have a negative impact on who we're becoming, on our heart? Have you put career as your number 1 priority? Have you put physical pleasure as your number 1 priority? Have you put being powerful, being famous, or being recognized as your highest priority? Jesus invites us to putting God as our first priority. And when he is your first priority, all the other priorities fall into a healthy alignment and balance in your world. And finally, your people. Your people. People will offend you. People will hurt you. People will do you wrong. It could be anyone from your spouse, your neighbor, your leaders, your pastor, your children, your parent. That will happen. So the Jesus way invites you and I to forgive, to be patient, to show kindness in the face of being annoyed, offended, and hurt. So as we finish today, what I want to do, we're going to go way back in time, way back. About a couple of thousand years even before Jesus, where the people of God had just been delivered from slavery. We can find this story in the Old Testament. And they were brought into the land of Canaan. And they were surrounded by a whole lot of different nations and different ways of doing life. And so the people of God were invited to do life according to God's way. And I want to leave you with a confession here that you can all take home with you and confess over your life every single day. But what we're going to do as I read it out, at the end of it, I'm going to ask us to stand and we're going to sing together. And we're going to sing one of the songs we sang earlier. And it's a chance for you in your life maybe to consider, have you let something about the environments around you get into your head, get into your heart, or get into your homes? And this will be a chance again to turn those around and confess what you're believing for in your life and confess God's plan for your future. And so this happened with Joshua. He was of an old age, had all the people, all the God's people, all the Hebrew people settled in the land of Canaan. And this was his encouragement to him right before he died. He said this in the book of Joshua. He says, you got to choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors that your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. So that's the same for you and I now. You got to choose. Choose what you're going to do with your life. Choose how you're going to live. Choose what boundaries and protections and habits you're going to put in your life. Choose how you defend your home, your head, your heart. Make a decision. You're going to take on the values of the land in which you're living or something higher, something better, and something more brighter. And he said as his own confession, it's a confession I want us all. He says, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And you can insert any word there. As for me in my head, as for me in my heart, as for me in my home, as for me in the areas that I am a steward of and I am responsible for, here's my prayer, here's my commitment, here's my God, would you help me do this every day? We will serve the Lord. I don't want to just be a slave of the culture around me. I just want to do what culture around me says I got to do. I just don't want to take on the values of the world around me. I want to be intentional about following the ways of the God who loved me so much that he gave his own life for me, that I could be invited into this amazing life of hope and promise and eternity, which is what you and I encouraged in Jesus Christ. So